Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Hey everybody, this is Brian back with another episode of Grief to Growth, and today I've got with me William Peters. I've known William for about 4 years now. I've been following his work, but this is the first time he and I have actually talked face to face. But he's the founder of the Shared Crossing Project, and he's director of its research initiative. And what it is, it's a nonprofit that works to raise awareness and educate people about the profound and healing experiences that are possible for the dying and their loved ones. He's a global leader in shared death studies and end-of-life phenomena. He conducts workshops and presents internationally. He's a psychotherapist specializing in grief and bereavement, and started as a hospice worker with the Zen Hospice Project in San Francisco. He's had 2 NDEs and a variety of shared crossings that inform his perspective on death, dying, and the afterlife. William's work has appeared in the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, Omega Journal of Death and Dying, and CNN News. His best-selling book is called At Heaven's Door, which shared journeys to the afterlife teach about dying and living better. And that was recently published by Simon & Schuster. We'll be talking about his book today. The website I'll say this again later, but I'll just say it now while we're here, is sharedcrossing.com. So with that, I want to welcome to Grief to Growth, William Peters.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. As I was saying, I don't know that you knew it, but I've been following your work for a while. And we happened to run into each other at a conference a couple of weeks ago. And I was like, I got to get this guy on because everybody needs to know about the shared death experience, but I don't think a lot of people do. So let's start with, what is a shared death experience?
Yes. So a shared death experience occurs when somebody dies and a loved one, caregiver, or bystander, even often a healthcare worker, will report that they shared in the journey from this human life into the afterlife. Of course, that's going with the dying person. And this is experienced in a number of different ways. Sometimes it's just sensing, and they feel like they've just had this sense that a person's dying and they feel the journey, if you will. And then, but the most common way we have is that they actually witness and observe what we call death-related phenomena, which is seeing deceased relatives or participating in a life review of sorts, or seeing the light. Oftentimes, and the most common experience is the shared death experiencer sees the dying progressing along this journey. Now, there are a couple of features that are important in the SDE. The first one is that the dominant motif is journey. There has to be this sense of movement that the experiencer is sensing, feeling, observing, or in some cases actually accompanying the dying along this pathway. If it's not that, then it's another experience. Could be pre-death dream or vision, could be post-death vision or visitation, what have you. But that's the distinguishing element. Also, the shared death experience yields this sense of everything's about love. It's this kind of, the people that have these experiences will come back and say, it was all love and I understood everything. So we say it's love and understanding. And the phenomena are identical. If, we say identical because we haven't seen any phenomena in the SDE that don't appear in an NDE. So very similar phenomena.
Yeah, I think, again, most people are familiar with the NDE, and we've heard of dream visitations and sometimes even apparitions or something that'll happen when someone's crossing over. But I don't know that a lot of people are familiar with the shared death experience. So I really appreciate you getting that message out there, and I appreciate you explaining in such detail what it is. This idea of almost going along with the person as they're crossing over.
Yes, exactly. And that's why the bond is between the experiencer and the person dying is really important. And that we see as kind of the substrate of the relationship. Now, we do have healthcare workers, hospice workers in particular, who will have SDE with their patients. And some people will say, well, why didn't the brother, partner, loved one have the SDE with the person dying rather than the hospice worker? Well, what we often find in these cases is the hospice worker will say something like, I was really close to so-and-so when he or she was dying.
Mhm.
And there's often this experience as well. And her family was resistant to her dying. And so at that moment of death, there seems to be the dying may reach out to somebody who's really affirming and there for them around the transition piece itself. So we don't have a lot of those cases, but sometimes you scratch your head and say, wait a minute, the family was around the bed, but the hospice nurse was there too, and she had the experience. Now, you can have a multi-person SDE as well. More than one person can have it, but we only see that in about 12% of our cases. And that would be a low number. The reason why is when we're doing research to actually validate and document a multi-person SDE, it takes those family members who have had it to share the experience. And funny thing that we found is oftentimes family members are divided about whether they want to share it or not. And so that dampens down our data as to how many times a shared SDE might occur.
Yeah, I would imagine some people might think it's a personal thing, but some people also might feel like people are going to think I'm crazy.
Both. You're right, Brian. We get both of those.
So I'm curious, how did you get into this field? Because you're the only person I know that's doing this work.
Yeah, so I mean, I had a near-death experience when I was 17 years old, a high-speed skiing accident, and it was a classic near-death experience. On impact, I catapulted out of my body. I saw my body on the ski slopes. I was moving away rapidly. At some point, I had a satellite view of my body on the ski slopes. And all the time I was moving away, I was having a life review. So I got to see every detail of my life played out for me. Then I saw the light out in the distance. I was just a beautiful galaxy, but the light got my attention and I realized, oh, I'm dying. Wow, I'm dying and I don't want to die. Unlike so many near-death experiencers, I actually pled with God to come back and have more of my life. So I did. But before I came back, while I was in the light, just as I say, God was pushing me back to earth, I heard, make something of your life. And that was quite profound. So I would have another near-death experience about a decade later in an ICU where I had a blood imbalance. And in that situation, I just found myself in the middle of the night hovering above, at the top of the ICU, just below the ceiling. And it was quite beautiful experience. I had no pain. I was a free-floating consciousness. I was there for a long time, listening to conversations of nurses and janitors and other healthcare staff. And I didn't even know I had a body down below until the doctor tapped on my hand. And I was asleep, so it looked, I was unconscious in that ICU bed. But when he tapped on me and called out my name, I said, oh, I'll look over. I got, not much going on in the ICU at 4 o'clock in the morning. So I moved over there and looked. I go, oh my gosh, that's me. That's me down below there. And then I had this question about whether I would answer him, because you say, Mr. Peters, I want to, would you wake up? And then I said, okay, I'll answer him. And as I did answer him, I filled in my body. And the view of the doctor changed from seeing him from above, looking at his crown, to now looking through my eyes right into his spectacles. And that was an interesting, rapid shift of perspective. So those are my two NDEs. But I also worked in San Francisco during the AIDS epidemic. And this would be the late 80s. This happened between my two SDEs. And when I was working with these communities, primarily of gay men who were dying of the HIV virus, I provided social services, I've provided counseling services, grief and bereavement. And I befriended a lot of people in the community because this was a hard time. And I was somebody who was very receptive just to provide services. I mean, that was my job, but I really enjoyed providing the services and having conversations that that gave me insight into what these communities were going through and how I could help. So I made friends with one gentleman whose name is Brad. Well, I changed the name. I'm thinking of his real name, and then in the book I changed his name, just so you know. So it's Brad. And Brad was kind of a death doula before his time, or what we might want to call as a psychopomp, in the sense that he helped soul spirits in human bodies cross over into the afterlife.
Wow.
And so he would share stories with me. And one day he came in and shared this story that just really opened my heart. And you'll see why when I share it with you, why it resonated with me. He talked about his, he called him his brother. All of them, they were homeless, and they lived in encampments and in a burned out building in south of Market in San Francisco. And so, and he shared that as his brother was dying, Randy, the community of it sounded like about 8 to 10 people were gathered around his bed. And then they saw him rise out of his body up a cylinder of light. And as he got to the top of, like what sounded like the top of the room, he looked down at everybody, did Randy. He was healthy, he was happy, he was at peace. And he kind of bowed to everybody saying, thank you, thank you, thank you for caring for me. I love you. And I'll see you again later. And then he just bolted away. And so that experience had happened not more than a few hours before Randy came into my office, and he was quite emotionally moved by it. He was weeping as he shared the story. And when I heard it, I immediately remembered my own first near-death experience, about how I had risen out of my body and how I had seen that light, and how I ascended upwards. And so and he looked at me and he says, do you believe me? And I looked at him and I said, believe you? And it just struck me as so strange. It's like, well, of course I believe you. And it was such a natural response. Like, it made me think, people don't believe these experiences. So, I was only at that time 25, 26, 27 years old in that time period. And so I always had a sense for an afterlife. I grew up Catholic. Now, the afterlife that I learned about in the NDEs was radically different, but still, I just found it interesting that and I would learn that. And in my research, Brian, this is what we see, is that people who have the SDE are very scared of sharing it. They'll often be in a hospital with someone dying, and they'll have the experience. And sometimes, many years later, they'll come and see me, and I'll say, well, have you shared this with anybody? And they'll say, well, I shared it with my partner or my best friend. And I'll say, well, how was that? And they go, well, they heard me, but it's, it wasn't like they were like, tell me more. It was kind of like, and you started out our interview saying this very well. I think we know the SDE is just now coming into public awareness, and people are talking about this, and the mere fact of your generosity to invite me onto your show here today suggests that there is increasing interest. But people are afraid to share these experiences, not all the time, but can be. We certainly find that in our interviews. About 39% of our interviewees will say that they feel some apprehension about either being dismissed, discounted, or ridiculed.
Yeah. Well, we talked about, I think before we started recording, Raymond Moody kind of opened the door in the late 1970s for the near-death experience, even though people have been having them for thousands of years. The SDE, I can only think of one other person. I've had her on my program. Her name is Lisa Jones. I can say because she's been on the program a couple of times. And I heard her tell her story. I can't remember if this before I met you or after. And I'm like, I've never heard of anything like this. And for people that don't know, she accompanied her husband who was passing up to a certain point and saw like the whole family there waiting and him being announced and the whole, and I'm getting goosebumps just as I say this, and the whole going home, and got to witness that. And I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah. And Lisa's experience is lovely because she also talks about the greeting party that you mentioned with the family, the deceased relatives there. But she also talks about a palace, a really huge, and a party that's being prepared. So there's a lot. She doesn't see the party, but she sees people scurrying about to get ready for the arrival of her husband's untimely death. So yes, you are. I agree. I mean, I think, well, I can say this, that the interest in SDE and people's reaching out to me since my book came out, and which had only happened in January of this year, has been overwhelming. I mean, I am thankful that people are genuinely interested in lots of interviews, lots of podcasts, lots of good people like you who are in the know about, hey, what's of interest right now, what's trending in a positive way, and I feel like that is what's happening for the shared death experience currently.
Well, I want to promote anything that promotes hope to people. So the SDE, STE, as in spiritually transformative experiences, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, that all point to the same thing, that we are consciousness living in a body temporarily. When the body dies, we go home, But the thing about the shared death experience that is, I think, kind of different from some of the other ones maybe is, and the thing I love about your institute, I'm going to talk about this, is people can plan to try to facilitate a shared death experience, which I learned when I heard you speak 4 years ago at the AREI conference. So talk about that, because it's great to have these experiences, near-death experiences. You don't want to have this. I always tell people say, I'd like to have a near-death experience. Everybody I've talked to says you don't want to have one. But the shared death experience might be different.
Well, yeah, and there's a key difference. Obviously, a near-death experience is typically some sort of significant physiological stress. Doesn't have to be a brush with death, but most of them are. And a shared death experience is experienced by, like I said, a caregiver, a loved one, healthy in mind and body. And in 2/3 of the cases that we have found, and now over 250 plus cases we've deeply analyzed, 2/3 of them are remote. So you're just doing your life, and all of a sudden, whoa, I'm thinking of Aunt Betty, and I'm seeing my grandmother and a lot of family members, and why am I seeing scenes of my life together with Aunt Betty? So this is people just cooking, and all of a sudden that pops into their mind. So they're clearly not harmful at all to anyone's health, and they're available to everyone, and that means because everyone we know is going to die, and we are too. So yeah. And I think you asked another question, Brian. I don't know if I answered it.
Well, we're talking about the fact that people don't really know about this, but so we're trying to do I'm trying to do two things with this program. One is to raise awareness on that, but also let people know how you can facilitate this, how you might be able to have it happening.
Yeah.
If you've got a loved one that sometimes people go suddenly, then nothing we can do about that. But if you have a loved one that is slipping away, is there something that we can do to maybe increase our chances of having one of these?
Yeah. So I'm going to say a couple things. First is the most basic thing you can do if you happen to be at bedside is when somebody is dying, attune deeply to them. Close your eyes, breathe with them, gently place your hand somewhere. I like to put it on a pulse because it really puts you in touch with how their internal organs are functioning. And you'll feel it slow down, or you'll feel it, do all sorts of changes towards stopping and go, so all sorts of, that's just a deep connection to that being.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, clear, you don't have to so much clear your mind, but do really meditative breathing and allow yourself to go with whatever images appear to you or thoughts that appear to you. And that's it. And that's the most basic way. And do we know how many that yields? No, because I know that that's the most simple way to do it. Now, there are far more in-depth trainings, and we offer them. I have a whole program that I've done for over a decade called the Shared Crossing Pathway Seminar. And it does three things. It first raises people's awareness and educates them about a variety of shared crossing experiences, a variety of spiritual end-of-life experiences. The pinnacle experience is the SDE for sure, but there's also pre-death dreams and visions. There's also terminal lucidity. There's post-death visions and visitations. There's synchronicities throughout. So I do a good deal of kind of training and education about that on the first day of the seminar. It's just really an evening. It's like a few hours in the evening. And then on day two, I do what I call death prep. And that is, we review our lives. We look for regrets. We look for the unfinished business of our lives. And then we work with ourselves to bring in compassion and forgiveness. And we make menses where we can. And then what we find ourselves naturally moving towards is gratitude. And then when that kind of primes the pump for psycho-emotional, spiritual clearing, because what we know is when someone's dying, if they have unfinished business, it tends to be a weight or hook that makes the transition a little bit more difficult. So if you can get clear psycho-emotionally, spiritually with yourself and with people, that helps. And then we set people up with this, I'll even tell you the exercise, it's quite lovely. We have people sit across from each other, especially if they know each other. You can do this inside your, intrapsychically, like in your mind's eye, or if you come with somebody to the workshop, you can sit across from them and do this exercise we call thank you, I love you, goodbye. And what that means is you thank the person for the life you shared together. You tell them, I love you. And then you say something like goodbye, but goodbye is more of a bit of a statement that has some texture in it. Like, we've spent such a lovely life together. I just want to thank you and acknowledge that one of us will be dying from the other. So I want to say goodbye now. I want to honor that death will come to one of us at some point. And these are profound exercises. And then we go into the third part of the program is teaching the shared crossing protocols, which I like to say that I developed, but the truth of the matter is they were like dropped into my mind. Like, you might want to call it a psychic download. When I first heard about the shared death experience from Raymond Moody, I was so excited. I ran up to him and I said, Raymond, I've had these experiences and I think I actually know how to make them happen. And he laughed. He says, we don't know anything about how these experiences happen. I said, oh no, I think I know how to make them happen. He goes, well, do tell. And then later on at that conference we talked, but that day they dropped into my mind about some key, the landscape, which is not typically a visual landscape. It's more of an energetic landscape, but it's really trainable. And so I do guided visualizations with people, and I teach people how to call back to their surviving loved ones. So there's all these steps that we do in this workshop. And by the way, I do it both in person and online. Online, has been the impetus of the pandemic. Before, we used to always gather up in different places around the country,
Right.
and do it. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of answering it. But the real point being is, we find that we can train people in having certainly different types of shared crossings, because about 80 to 90% of our participants will get back to us within 6 months to a year and say, I had this, I had that. And it's anecdotal, but we're going to do a deeper dig on it coming up here. We're putting that questionnaire together. But the SDE itself, that kind of queen of experiences, if you will, about 25% to 50%. And I think I think we can do better with that, especially as there's more cultural fluency with the concept.
Right.
Once it gets more into our cultural DNA, so to speak.
So when you're training people, are you training them from the perspective of being the witness, or being the person crossing, or both?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, we go back and forth, and that's why we work in dyads. And as we know, you never know who's going to die first or second in our relationship. So we may think we know, but we do it both ways.
Right.
And there's a fair amount of what I call entrainment. So the more we do these guided visualizations and practices, the more a groove gets laid down in our, I think it's just our kind of neuropsychology, if you will. But here's another statistic that's very interesting. We found that 41% of our now 250 plus cases, 41% will have more than one SDE. So that tells you this is something that can be trained and acquired. And we run with that, because that's the best news that we've heard. Because once people start having these, they really want to be around death, and they want to help people. They want to, they want to go into the afterlife with their loved ones. And who could blame them? Because it's really a beautiful, lovely, blissful, awe-inspiring experience.
And as you're saying this, I'm getting goosebumps, and I'm just really energized, I guess, is for lack of a better word, because we see death as dark, as something to be feared. We see it as the end. And my whole mission is to break that, right? And if you, like, when I think about Lisa's story and looking at her husband going off to this great adventure, and you're talking about this journey and this traveling, it's not the end for our loved one. It's like a whole new beginning that we're all going to go through. And that's what I love about what you're doing is it's just changing that perspective.
Yes, it's birth into another dimension, which from all reports that we've had and others who study in this field tell us is far more desirable than being in the earth plane. The earth plane in the human realm is a pretty tough realm. There's a good deal of pain and suffering. I don't need to tell you that, Brian.
Right.
You're well aware of that.
Right. Yeah, like I said, I think that I want to do anything I can to raise awareness of this, because when I heard you speak a few years ago, I'm like, this is something that people don't know. And when I heard your training on it, because that was a part that surprised me, is that we can learn to have this. And there's kind of a hierarchy, as you said. I was just talking with a neighbor the other day. Her brother passed away very recently. And she was telling me about 3 experiences that she had. One was like, she thought she kind of saw him out of the corner of her eye. And the other was a couple of signs where something in her house, kind of strange happened. But, she told me, because I'm out there, I don't know if people think I'm crazy or not, whatever they think, but I'm out there. I share my experiences. I bring on people that share their experiences, and it gives people permission to share their experiences. So it'd be really interesting to see once the shared death experience becomes more known if we see there's a lot more people having them than we might think.
I think you're right. That they are far more ubiquitous than we know. One of the most common experiences I have is I go to a conference, I'll give a talk, and afterwards, a few dozen people will come up to me and say, I mean, even walking down the hall at the last conference we were at, in Arizona there, Ryan, that was a big conference. Mm-hmm. And I'm telling you, I couldn't go down the hall for the rest of the conference after I gave my talk. Someone would just run into me and just say, oh, hey, I wanted to talk to you. I had this, and this. And I just so appreciate that, because people, when they're saying it to me, they're not saying it with a sense of, hey, is this real or not? If they've heard me speak and I've done a little research themselves on it, they'll realize that their experience is indeed validated. They are affirmed, and they want to share it. And I love hearing it. So, but before hearing a talk of mine, typically, they didn't know they had one. So I'm sure they're lurking in much higher numbers. I mean, if we look at the literature in near-death experiences, they say it's about 4%. So, in the United States, that's going to be something like, 12 to 14 million people. But just think, that takes a near-death experience. But people are dying all the time. And if that veil opens, if you will, similarly at the NDE as an SDE, then there's a lot of opportunities to have an SDE for people. So I'm not making any predictions about what percentage of the American population it is, but it would certainly be higher than the NDE population.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because even with NDEs, we're finding out the percentages are higher than we thought the more that we do research into them. And when you think about the numbers, there's like 350 million people in the United States. That's a lot of NDEs that have been had. And I hear some people say, oh, it's just anecdotal, or there's small numbers, and they try to explain it away. But there's a lot of people having them. There's a lot of people on Earth, and there's thousands or millions of people that have had these experiences.
Yeah. Yes.
So in your research, what have you found? How does the SDE, the shared death experience, I would have to be careful I don't say STE, but how does the SDE, how does it impact people's grief?
We'll get back to Grief to Growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best-selling, easy-to-read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.grief2growth.com, or text growth, GROWTH, to 31996. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grieftogrowth, www.patreon.com/GRIEF2GROWTH to make a financial contribution. And now back to Grief to Growth.
A beautiful question, and one that I am keenly focused on as a grief and bereavement psychotherapist. This is what was so moving to me, is that when I have clients who come to see me for grief and bereavement and they have an SDE, what they tend to express is something like this. Well, I know my loved one, I feel the loss of my loved one, and it's heartbreaking. But I also know that my loved one is alive and well somewhere, and that we'll be reunited again. And they're not going to say that my grief isn't so bad. But me as a clinician who knows what grief looks like at different levels and how people are processing it, I say that SDE experiencers have grief processes that are contextualized with a cushion of SDE, a sense of, yes, you miss your loved one, but you also know your loved one is alive and well. And you also know that death is not an end, because that's another one of the after effects with the SDE, is that
Mhm.
they report that they don't fear death anymore. They don't have anxiety about death anymore. They realize death is a transition. We're all going to do it. And in some cases, they're excited about it. Most cases, they're just like, oh, I'll wait till my time comes.
Yeah.
So yeah, so grief and bereavement processes with SDE experiencers are, significantly less painful in a certain way.
Yeah. I love the way you put that. I've never heard it put that way, contextualize with a cushion.
Yeah.
Because I look at as grief as having two components. Well, it's got many, but from this perspective, two components. I'm grieving for myself, for my loss, and I'm grieving for my loved one's loss of life. And no matter how old they are, if they're 80, 90, 100 years old, we still grieve their loss, what we perceive as their loss of life, their loss of opportunity, especially I think the younger they are, with my daughter being 15, we perceive a bigger loss. But the thing that this does, it takes away half of that. It doesn't mean that you don't grieve, but now you're grieving for yourself as opposed to grieving for your loved one. And that's a blessing that I've had. I've never grieved for my daughter. I've grieved her loss, but I haven't grieved what she lost.
That's makes sense to me. I think, I know from the research, when we, engage our participants in, their type of grief as it relates to the loss of life for their loved one, what they often say is almost flippantly, oh, I know he or she's alive and well and fine. It's my loss I'm dealing with. I know she's okay.
Yeah.
And that's a rather strong statement, but it comes out so natural for the experiencers.
I've been immersed in this so long now. It's been about 6 years I've been with helping parents heal. And that's pretty much added. I can't say everybody in the organization, there's 20,000 people, but that's the attitude of the organization. It's kind of like our loved ones are okay. They're happy, healthy, they're whole.
Yeah.
I've been hanging around with people like you and, Suzanne Giesman and all these different people. And that's a very freeing perspective that I think sometimes we might take for granted that other people don't have, that they're like, that person has lost something and we grieve because of them. And again, I think that's what's so important about this, and removal of the fear of death, which is another side effect of the NDE. Same thing as with the SDE. People that have had shared death experience and NDEs are like, I don't fear death. You said some people aren't rushing towards it. I've heard people say I still feel the fear of the process, but being dead, I'm cool with that.
Yeah. Well, dying is different than death.
Right.
Dying it can be a painful process, but death itself, pretty natural.
So, you tell me about one, because you've had a couple of SDEs, right?
Yeah, numerous.
Can you tell me about one of them?
Yeah, I'll share one that I had with my father, and this is just 2 years ago. And he was dying. This is during COVID. So you imagine us in PPE around his bed in his memory care facility.
Mm.
And I'm on one side, close to his, shoulders up near his head. And my mother's on the other side, because my mother was in bed with him. And my sister's there as well on the other side, more towards his feet.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm doing what I tend to do, which is I have my hand on his pulse around his wrist, and I'm breathing with him. And as people get close to death, they often get altered breathing patterns. And so I'm just matching my breath with his, and then I'm closing my eyes to sense and feel him in a certain way, because he's unresponsive. So I'm just feeling into his energetics, if you will. And as I do that, I see popping up to my left. It's not so much that it popped up. It's like it just kind of came into view now, slowly. And then, wow, there's my grandmother and my aunt, both predeceased. And then there's this gentleman who's in a suit, who I recognize as my grandfather, but I'd never seen him in my life. He died before I was born. And he runs over, it's kind of interesting, but he moves over from the foot of the bed over to my mother. And I say to my mother, hey, Grandpa Bill is moving over to communicate something to you. And he's telling you, thank you for having been such a wonderful wife to my son for 64 years.
Mm.
And I'm just getting all that. Now this, this is not words that I hear audibly. And we find that this is either called what's often referred to in the research community as thought transference, or telepathic communication. But I'm getting it loud and clear what's going on. And then I go back to my grandmother and aunt who I knew from my life. And I noticed that there is a white light, like a stairway coming down from where they are, about a quarter way to where he is. And I'm here with them, asking them questions in my mind. And at one point I go, why aren't you taking him? Because he's ready to go and he's, and they look at me, my aunt and grandmother, and they almost look at me in a certain way that they take my attention, and with their eyes, they avert my attention and move it over to the center of the bed, just over the abdomen of my father, but elevated a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, I lock my energy with a being, a presence. I can't see it, but I feel it. And I start weeping. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a being that I have labeled the conductor. This is that force in the shared death experience. It's not just in the shared death experience, but in the shared death experience, you get a glimpse at it, or at least an experience of it. This being is in charge of moving human spirit, souls, consciousness from a human body into the afterlife. And I felt this conductor. And as I felt it, I thought, oh, now I should, say that I've been fascinated with the conductor for a number of years. And I didn't think that in my father's death, I would even have an SDE, although I'm glad I did for sure. But the fact that I was kind of gifted this experience of the conductor was spectacular. And then, sometime later, my father transitioned. The conductor was just basically giving me a sense that we're getting there and don't worry about it. But the conductor is like kind of businesslike, it's not there for me. Seemed to be managing a lot and waiting for the right time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an SDE. Yeah.
Yeah. And there is a process to death. I don't know if you caught Julie Ryan's presentation at the Healthy Periods Hill conference. It was really interesting, her talking about this process that goes on and how these beings gather. And I think everyone's a little bit different, but there's also, it's orderly. It's not like there seems to be a time, and there's a time for people to go. So I think people might be surprised to find out that there's preparations on the other side, and there are beings that move us over, and helpers and stuff like that. It's a really fascinating process the more we study it.
Yes, it is. It is, Brian. And the SDE is one glimpse into the mechanics of it, both the mechanics and the pathway. And one of the things I will mention about SDEs that I find fascinating is that light is presented in various different ways. Oftentimes it's a light way in the distance, a pinprick or a manhole of light. Sometimes it's a cylinder of light. Sometimes it's like an escalator of light. It's almost always leading upwards. And that's a big theme in the SDE, is ascension, journey with ascension heading upwards. So yeah. And I've had a number of other ones. I've had some basic SDEs where I'm just sitting with somebody. I just had one 3 weeks ago when a family member died. Um, and we, she was on memory, she was in memory care. We knew she was going. And I just moments after she died, I was there. And by the way, that tells you about 77% of our SDEs happen right at the moment of, medically determined death, cessation of brain waves and heart stopping. But we also have about 9% that happen a few moments, hours before, and also about 14% after, a little bit after. So in this case, I was there and with this family member. And as I was there, maybe 20, 25 minutes after she died, and I was just there and I just closed my eyes and I just said, which I do often. And I said this earlier, but I'll say it again a bit. Close my eyes and say, I wish you well. I thank you for having shared your life with me. I love you. Be well. Godspeed. Be well. And if I can help in any way, if you want to send me a message, my heart and mind are open to you. And boom, just in doing that, a few moments later, she didn't so much appear to me as some of her family members did, which is my family members. But I should say family members distantly. She was elderly. So these are people, her parents, which should be quite old. I'd never met them, but I'd heard of them. So when they appeared, I knew who they were. And that's one of the things. When people appear, you tend to know who they are, even if you've met them or not, even if you've never met them. You just get a sense for who they are.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just another one. But there are adepts with this, and I said that 41% will have more than one, and I've had probably a couple dozen. I don't know people who have had more than me, but I know there are. I think there are. I'll tell you who has. More indigenous cultures where they have shamans and such, who I have had some conversations where I ask them about the SDE and they kind of look at me and say, yeah, of course, all the time. And I'm kind of, oh, okay. Yeah. I'm just a little Western guy who's kind of way behind the times. I know the ancient wisdom hasn't changed for those who haven't lost it. So, so yeah, I hope that helps give some texture to this.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. I'm curious, as a rational kind of person, I'm a chemical engineer, and NDEs are awesome. I love studying NDEs. What's really cool is the veridical NDEs, where there's some evidence that someone's witnessed something. Are there any veridical SDEs where people can say that they saw something that someone else can verify, or they know the moment of death through someone who was remote or something like that?
Well, we do have a number of veridical around the time of death. Somebody will say, I had this, well, they say it's a dream, but that's just what they call it. Because if they're sleeping and they have the SDE, they'll say, well, I was dreaming but they had the SDE, and when they corroborate the time later, they realize, oh my God, that was just at the time that so-and-so died. They got up, they looked at their clock radio, and boom, they record it and remember it. So yeah, we do have some of those. We also have some very interesting veridicals in terms of, like, here's a great one. This is from someone who's in my book as well, Sonia. You'll remember her, because if your listeners do get a chance to go to the book, Sonia has a couple really beautiful SDEs. But in one, she talks about she's in Massachusetts and her good friend is dying in Santa Barbara. And she feels like she's put to sleep at around 7 o'clock or so in the evening. And she finds out that's just the time. Later, she finds out that's just the time that her friend Denny was dying in Santa Barbara.
Oh, wow.
But then interesting about this is the vision she sees of Denny, the dress she sees Denny in, later that month, she is looking in a catalog and she sees this dress and it just grabs her. And she says, that's the dress Denny has on, and I've never seen that dress before. And so for her, it was evidential that this was a foretelling, if you will, about that she would get confirmation later for the experience. So yes, we do have some veridicals, but veridicals with SDEs are a little bit harder.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I was curious about that because I think again, skeptics, they're going to be there. I believe all this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's and people try to explain, okay, why maybe it's just wishful thinking, maybe it's hallucinations, stuff like that. So even those few kind of can help to say, okay, well, we can't verify all of them, but we can verify some of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
tell me more about the research that you guys do, because I saw your talk at IANS, and for anybody that does happen to have the access to the recordings of IANS, I do recommend you go listen to William's talk, because it was fascinating watching you interview some of the people who had shared death experiences. So tell me about the Research Institute.
So the Shared Crossing Research Institute, our mission is to collect and document the SDE. We are the first research institute to create a typology. And I did this, a number of years ago, even before we started doing the research. It was done clinically. I started seeing patterns. And then we did our first research starting in, we did a research project in 2013, 14, 15, testing the methods. Originally, the methods we used to facilitate the SDE. And we found, one of the problems is people don't die, so it's hard to try to get valid data. So we have to wait for people to die. But like I said, I already shared that already, about 25 to 50%, we are pretty sure have an SDE after they've done our methods, our courses. So there's that. But then, then what's happened is we've really identified the different types of SDEs that occur. And, there's more detail in my book about that, but, they're at bedside, they're remote, their time-space continuum is different. It doesn't make, 75% at the time of death, roughly 77%, and then 23% before, a little bit before or after. Multi-person SDEs, we know those happen with 12%. I have statistics for, all the different features that we found. But really what the research did was document this experience in its myriad of forms. You'll find that the SDE can happen in all sorts of relationships. A very common one is, and it's sad, is a mother and a son. As we know, adolescent to young adult boys die at a higher frequency than the general population. And we have a lot of mothers, primarily through the organization that, Brian, you and I are both, you're actually very involved with them, and I am too, as a guest speaker and presenter of sorts, but helping parents heal. So a lot of mothers in particular have shared their experiences with us. But the research really points out not just the features of it, because there are some spectacular features when you think of people accompanying their loved ones into the afterlife and seeing deceased relatives and seeing elevated spirit beings and going to the light and coming up against a boundary and sharing in past life reviews. All this is spectacular phenomena that we've documented. But what is most important in the research is the therapeutic benefits. The fact that people who have an SDE will say, we know that our loved ones are alive and well. We know we'll see them again. I no longer fear death, and that their grief and bereavement is better. As we've said, it has a comfort, it has a cushion to it, as one person says, my grief was lightened by my SDE, lightened, which is an interesting word. And then people come back with some sort of psychic abilities and a renewed purpose for their life. You'll see all sorts of people changing their relationships in a good way, like maybe not changing them, but strengthening them, or doubling down on what matters most for them. And so these are positive, transformational gifts. I think if there's anything you can say about the SDE, it's a transformational experience when it can be honored. And the way that it gets honored is through sharing it with people. And, if you want to go see a skilled, therapist, or just a grief and bereavement, anybody who can really help you walk through it and affirm it, that does so much for grounding the experience in you. And then when you take an SDE, like any spiritual experience, and you work with it, it will invite you to do certain things. It will invite you to live often with a bit more awareness, mindfulness, consciousness, maybe with a more integrity. Those types of things are what is very heartening to me as an SDE researcher and clinician, that I see how these experiences make people's lives better.
Yeah, I love your where you are. I mean, being a researcher, but also being a psychotherapist, and seeing it's just fascinating to study from a scientific point of view, but it's really important the therapeutic benefit it has. I think that's awesome. So I was surprised to find out that you were able to get some of your research published in medical journals, because it's only been very recently they've even paid any attention to NDEs. So how do you feel like the medical community is coming along with this?
Thanks, Brian. It was quite an accomplishment, and I'm humbled by that, but also proud to say that when the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Medicine published the first article on the SDE, and of course, my team is the authors of that, and we publish under Shared Crossing Research Initiative rather than individual names, because we have a group of researchers that do it. Myself as a mental health provider, Dr. Monica Williams as an emergency room physician, and Dr. Michael Kinsella as a religious studies and cognitive science doctorate. And so we take this we look at it at different angles. And I think the research reviewers, the reviewers for these publications, really appreciate how we do try to cover all the angles when you look at this: medical, psychotherapeutic, spiritual, religious. And because of that, the reviews were stunningly positive. Like, thank you for doing this research. As one reviewer said, we all know these experiences happen, but we've never seen a research study that's passed the scholarly rigor to be published.
Right.
And ours did. I mean, ours was, it took us 3 years, and we had 164 cases, and I applied my typology to all of it. So they really got to see what an SDE is, and the pattern now is well recognized. How is it being received in medical sciences? And you said this quite well earlier, Brian, that the uptake with anything new in medical sciences, especially something like an SDE or NDE, that challenges the medical sciences view of consciousness in relationship to the brain. As we know, the medical sciences assert that the brain produces consciousness. Both the NDE and the SDE cannot live in that paradigm.
Right.
So we have an idea of, non-local consciousness. And so that's a hiccup, a big hiccup that I think keeps a lot of medical doctors from publicly stating their affirmation for our work. Privately, I can tell you at conferences and such, healthcare providers of all kinds are like, thank you so much. Now I can, go to our rounds and our staff meetings and say, here's the article. We need to include this in our treatment protocols. Awesome. And no longer are we going to say things like, you've had a death hallucination, or you're just under a lot of stress. And no, I think increasingly those days are gone.
That's awesome.
But it's a slow road, and it depends on the region you are in the country. So, and that's why I say, I'll say to your viewers, if you can in any way talk about this experience, even if you haven't had it, talk about it with your friends and family, and you'll find that people will say, oh, I think I might have had that. Mm-hmm. So, get the word out.
Well, I want to say congratulations on the medical journal, and congratulations on the book published by Simon & Schuster. That's another big accomplishment. So I want to give the name of the book. We're running short on time, but I want to give you time to talk about your book. So, and the title I want to get into the show, it's At Heaven's Door, with shared journeys to the afterlife, teach about dying well and living better. So tell me about your book.
So the book really covers 28 shared death experiences from our research. And we have a large library of these cases. And I really try to tell the stories from a real human perspective. I stay away from the woo-wee because I don't believe the gift of the SDE is the spectacular phenomena. It is spectacular. It is awe-inspiring. But the real power and value is in the connection that endures through death and beyond. It's that ongoing relationship and that sense that my loved one is still alive and there still is relationship. And then it becomes the work of the individual griever to decide how they want to shape and proceed and negotiate that relationship. So I do use a variety of different relationships. There's mothers and sons, there's spouses, there's best friends, there's healthcare workers, all sorts of different relationships that are all flavored differently. And at the end, my hope is that people come away with the sense of, wow, death is a lot more than I thought it was. And there's a lot more going on here. And there's a lot of beauty and love and understanding that comes when I can welcome death into my life and into my family. And I can allow myself to be transformed by these experiences.
Yeah. Wow. As you said, that welcome death into our families. It's like people are like, no, we don't want death. We want to keep death away. That's a bad thing. But, I have aging parents. I was telling you before, I think we started recording, my wife's, we've gone through this with her parents. And you mentioned the memory unit. So I go there and I see people losing who they are because their brains are failing them, not losing who they are because we're always whole on the other side, but physically that attachment is kind of wearing away. And there's a time for all of us to go. And it's really great when you can look at it as not a bad thing, when you can look at it as a next step in a journey.
Yeah.
So I thank you for doing what you're doing. It's really awesome.
Well, Brian, thank you for honoring and acknowledging my work, because it's the first decade of this was largely in obscurity and fighting perceptions of woo-wee. And this is not woo-wee. This is 100% human. We are all able to have this experience.
Yeah, I can only imagine how hard that must have been. So again, I appreciate your persistence. And I know you kind of touched on it earlier, but you do some training in this. So tell people what the training opportunities are.
Yeah, thanks. I did mention the pathway training earlier, and it's, if you go to sharedcrossing.com and just go to, it's either programs or discover, you'll see that we offer this pathway program online and in person. Before the pandemic, different groups or retreat centers would host me, and they would sponsor me. And so if you have people that want me to come out and do this, it usually takes a dozen or so people to make it worthwhile. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is the training that basically gives people the capacity through practices to enable a shared death experience and other shared crossings. Can we guarantee that an SDE is going to happen? No. I've already said about a quarter to 50% of our people report having them. Mm-hmm. And I think the training itself, it's a seminar, is so moving for people, because it's rare that you get to be with people who are talking so openly about their views of death and dying, what they want of it, what's possible, reviewing their lives together, talking about their death experiences, talking about their fears, and quite frankly, choreographing the death they want with their loved ones, and including a shared death experience or other shared crossings.
Yeah, I could see the training being worthwhile, whether you having a shared crossing would be awesome, of course. but just that training, it's just like, I've talked to people and they've asked me about my perspective on death. And I was talking with someone just the other day, and this guy actually has OBEs often. He goes out of the body and he helps people cross. And we were talking, I said, I don't have a fear of death anymore. And he said, well, why is that? Have you had out of body experience? I said, no. So have you had a near death experience? I said, no, but I've been studying near death experiences for about 30 years. And there is people, and Ken Ring did this research, people that study near death experiences can have some of the same benefits. And I'm sure the same is true with the shared death experience, and just talking about these things. And it just changes your mind. It changes your brain about the way you look at it.
It does, Brian. And you brought up Ken Ring, who was dedicated to educating people about the NDE for its therapeutic benefits. And the term that Ken and others coined was the benign virus.
Yeah, I love that.
And the SDE is the same. One of the things, experiences I love is at the end of a pathway training, we gather up for a picture and, we hug and say goodbye and everything. But as we're doing that, I just say, how do you guys feel about death and dying now? And they're all light up and say, I am excited. I'm ready. No, I don't want to die now. No, I don't want my loved ones to know. But when it comes, I'm ready. I am ready. And that just makes me feel so happy, because so many people are surprised by death, and we really shouldn't be. I mean, sudden deaths, yes. But, so many of us have deaths that are kind of predictable in a certain way. I mean, the vast majority of people go into disease processes of one or the other, and they're heading towards the exit. And we're all doing a dance as if, there's going to be a cure, or we can prolong this, or medical interventions are going to save this person. And it's really a rather traumatic exercise that's unnecessary.
Yes.
So
it's very sad. And I say to people, it's the only thing we know with 100% certainty is that when you're born, that you're going to die. And but it's not a bad thing. That, I know there's some people that sounds really horrible, fatalistic, but it's true. And we might as well embrace it. And there's so much good, so I thank you for being here. We're a little bit over on time. But William, it's been really enjoyable getting to know you. It's been fascinating. I hope more and more people will come to Shared Crossing and find out what this is all about.
Thank you. And I have one thing: if your viewers have read my book or are going to buy the book at some point, write a review, because so many people come to Amazon or Barnes and Nobles or wherever you go, and I've learned from my publisher that 40% of the people that show up there will actually not know what book they're going to buy. And this is a type of book that if people see the good reviews on it, because they're saying afterlife, shared crossing, or SDE, and they see a good review, it helps them. If they see lots of reviews, so that's a request for those of you who want to kind of support this advocacy for more knowledge about SDEs.
Yeah, and I will echo that. As an author, it's almost impossible to get reviews. People will tell you how great your book is, but they won't review it. So I'm going to say to anybody listening to this, please go to Amazon and review the book. Read the book, review the book.
And just one line, even one line, Brian, as you know, it's just like, it doesn't have to be a big, long thing, just 5 stars or 4 stars or whatever. And and that just gets the word out in a good way.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for being here. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and the rest of your weekend.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Don't forget to hit that big red subscribe button, and click the notify bell. Thanks for being here.